Fill it up, fill her up. All right.
Welcome everyone, I'm Andrew Altfest. Thank you for being here with us tonight and weathering the storm, the polar vortex. We appreciate it. I'm going to make a few remarks and then I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. So we decided to have this event because we got such a great reaction from the Maggie Haberman event and that we had some weeks ago right after the election.
Tell them who that Maggie Haberman is.
For those of you who do not read the New York Times, Maggie Haberman is she's one of the people who's been following Trump around and is writing for the New York Times, and she gave us a great inside perspective around what it was like to follow Trump around and her thoughts on different policies. And so she was a great speaker who drew a lot of people and a lot of interest. And then we also had a really well-received lunch with Lou right after the election. And as a result of those things, we decided, well, why don't we have another seminar? And this came about. If you don't have a newsletter in front of you, please ask us for one. It actually has an article written by Lou and a couple other people at our firm about the economy. It was written very recently, and an article about year-end tax planning. So whether you supported Donald Trump or were like Amazon's Jeff Bezos and wished he can send Donald Trump to space, but yet I don't know if you saw this, he met with him yesterday at Trump Tower. It doesn't matter tonight. Tonight's discussion, we're not taking political sides. What we feel is important is recognizing that the new administration really represents change. And we have a proposed shift in policy, both from spending to tax cuts to trade agreements to rolling back regulations. And I think we've all seen this since the election. The stock market has rallied. Business confidence is higher. Interest rates have moved up. Bonds have sold off. And so we want to talk tonight around policy. And we have an expert with us tonight, Daniel Cadera, who's going to go into policy and provide more clarity around potential policy changes. And then we're going to talk about how these changes may affect your finances, the markets, investments, taxes. For those of you who do not know Altfest, I know we have some guests here with us today. Altfest, we're an independent financial planning and investment firm. We take a comprehensive approach to financial planning, from investments to tax planning to estate planning, risk management, company benefits decisions, and cash flow planning. And we offer our clients trust and transparency. We're straight shooters. We have just over 30 employees, so we're small enough to provide personal attention to our clients and to think about them specifically and individually. And we like to educate our clients, which you're seeing tonight. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have Daniel Cadera, who made it in the cold from Washington, D.C. to be with us today. He's a principal at the OBC Group, which is a Washington lobbying firm. It's a bipartisan firm, so they don't take sides either. So we're not taking sides tonight. OBC Group's clients include prominent Fortune 500 companies, and their activities cover a broad cross-section of national issues. Daniel Cadera served in the Obama administration working as the director of the Secretary's Briefing Book at the Department of Homeland Security. And he began his career as the director of scheduling for U.S. Senator Charles Schumer. And then our next speaker, Lou Altfest, who needs no introduction from most people in the room. He's the CEO of Altfest Personal Wealth Management, Chief Investment Officer, and he's also a professor of finance at Pace University. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I like to do these things more sort of free-flowing conversation. So if I say something that you either want more clarity on or just have questions, feel free to raise your hand or just shout out a question. We'll sort of try to make it a little bit more of a discussion so we hit on things specific to what you want to hear about or talk about. I'm also going to start with a little inside baseball education on two terms that I'm going to talk about that most people probably don't know the details of. The first one is called budget reconciliation. It is a congressional tool used in the Senate to avoid something called the filibuster, which allows the minority to block legislation from moving forward. So it's a tool that both sides have used. When Democrats were in the majority in the Senate, Republicans would filibuster legislation they didn't like. And when Republicans were in the majority in the Senate, Democrats would filibuster legislation they don't like. It takes 60 votes to break a filibuster unless you use a mechanism called budget reconciliation. So the budget reconciliation rules at its very fine point is essentially a instruction through a budget process to pass legislation that has to deal with either the debt ceiling, spending, or deficit reduction. If you craft a rule through the budget process that addresses one of those three things, either spending, deficit reduction, or the debt limit, you can move legislation forward through the Senate over a 20-hour period with 50 votes. So you're going to hear a lot about reconciliation within the next month, because as soon as the Congress comes back the first week of January, they're going to craft budget reconciliation rules to repeal the Affordable Care Act. The way the budget rule will be drafted to repeal the Affordable Care Act, though, because again it has to deal with spending, deficit reduction, or the debt ceiling, means that the parts of the Affordable Care Act that will be repealed are all the parts that involve tax. So that means the penalty on the individual mandate will be repealed. That means that Medicaid expansion, the states that have opted into Medicaid expansion, that will be repealed. That means the subsidies that low-income individuals get who make more money than to qualify for Medicaid, but not enough money to afford insurance, the full premium out of their own pocket, that will be repealed. It also means that for your business, that some of the taxes that have been put in place to pay for the Affordable Care Act, including a tax on high-income investors, will be repealed as a part of the Affordable Care Act. It means that some of the payroll tax on high-income individuals will be repealed as part of the Affordable Care Act. It does not mean that certain regulatory things as part of the Affordable Care Act will be repealed. That means that insurance companies will still not be able to not deny coverage for pre-existing conditions. That's regulatory. It can't be repealed because it doesn't have to do with spending. That means that if you have a child on your health care plan who's 25 years old, they can't be kicked off your health care plan now. That's also a regulatory rule. It means that insurance companies can't charge more for women than they charge for men, another regulatory part. So all the sort of regulatory non-spending aspects of the Affordable Care Act will stay in place, and it will only deal with the financial impact of the Affordable Care Act. But the other reason why reconciliation is important is because sometime in probably end of March to end of April, we expect to see the Senate create a second budget reconciliation for fiscal year 2018 that has to deal with taxes. And I know taxes are an important thing for everybody in this room, so the way they will structure the budget reconciliation on taxes will allow the Senate to pass tax reform with 51 votes, which means Republicans can do it on their own and don't need input for Democrats. So we can expect to see corporate tax reform. There's various ideas being floated out there now, which I'll get into in a little bit. We can see some international tax reform, which will include a repatriation of, depending on how they structure it, we could see a repatriation of upwards of $1 trillion in corporate money that's being stashed overseas, come back to the United States in some form. And there'll be personal tax reform included in there, which will include, if Republicans do it the way they want to right now, a repeal of the estate tax. One thing to keep in mind about using reconciliation for taxes are that the way the rules of reconciliation work, if something will increase the budget deficit after 10 years, it sunsets, and at the end of 10 years, those tax cuts, for instance, go away. So we're looking at a scenario where, for instance, and we saw reconciliation used for tax cuts before. So in both 2001 and 2003, Republicans used reconciliation to pass what's known as the Bush tax cuts in both of those years. And that's why we saw in 2011 the fight between the Obama administration and the Democratic Senate at the time and House Republicans over what to do about these expiring tax cuts. Who are we going to make them permanent for? Who are we going to raise them for? And that's where we ended up now with the 39.6% high-end rate, was the sort of compromise of, well, let's make permanent the lower and middle class tax cuts and then raise taxes on wealthy individuals. It also means that for things like estate planning purposes, that if you have a repeal of the estate tax, it's only going to be there for 10 years, which I know makes life for estate planners, financial planners, incredibly difficult and incredibly complicated. So that's sort of the world that we're getting into on reconciliation. The other term is something called the Congressional Budget Review Act. The Congressional Review Act allows Congress to review any piece of regulation that is enacted by a federal agency within 60 days of congressional session. So as long as Congress is in session, and it's session days, not just 60 calendar days. So as long as Congress has an opportunity over those 60 days to review any regulation, they have the right to pass legislation on a straight majority rule to undo the regulation and prevent the agency from enacting similar legislation moving forward. So it only takes 50 votes in the Senate and 218 votes in the House using the Congressional Review Act and then a signature from the president to undo any regulation. If we run the clock back, that means any regulation enacted from May 30th of this year moving forward, Congress has the right to enact legislation under the Congressional Review Act to repeal it. Republicans in the House passed legislation right before they left that would allow them to repeal regulation just in block. So they could basically say every regulation passed from May 30th moving forward, we're just repealing. The Senate didn't pass that legislation, so it's not law. They can't actually do it. And they won't be able to pass legislation to that effect moving forward because Senate Democrats will block it. That said, they're willing to look at each piece of regulation individually, and the House Freedom Caucus, which many people probably know is sort of the Tea Party faction of the Republican Party, rolled out a long list of regulations yesterday and said these are our top targets. It's everything from healthcare regulations to environmental regulations to regulations on student loans and for-profit colleges to the fiduciary rule to regulation on credit default swaps to everything you can possibly imagine. There's
Volcker rule.
Well, the Volcker rule, there have been some changes to it, but the actual rule itself is in the Dodd-Frank legislation, so they can't just remove the Volcker rule entirely. They can use their authority under Congressional Review Act to roll back any regulation that either the SEC or the Fed or FDIC or any of these groups said over the last basically 7 months to define how they're going to use the Volcker rule to actually regulate banks and bank holding companies. And the Volcker rule has a long trickle down impact of even going after, affiliate fund managers who are owned by banks or who share a name of a bank holding company or a whole host of things. But the actual Volcker rule itself will stay under Dodd-Frank. That said, Republicans have their goal of repealing Dodd-Frank entirely. So that will also be something they see. So those are sort of the two legislative vehicles that Republicans will use to get around the fact that the Senate is a 52-48 split between Republicans and Democrats, and despite being in the minority in the Senate, you have a whole bunch of power and clout to block things. My old boss, Chuck Schumer, who's now the minority leader and the Democratic leader in the Senate, is planning on doing everything in his power and using the rules of the Senate to slow things down, to block repeals of everything, to keep legislation from moving forward.
What rules exist that would enable him to do that?
So it's the way a normal bill moves through the Senate is once a bill is brought to the floor, the Senate Majority Leader files something called a motion to proceed. And this is sort of the craziness of the Senate. So in order to even consider talking about a bill, in order to consider even offering amendments to a bill on the floor, you need 60 senators to agree to a motion to proceed. If you get a vote and 60 senators or more agree to a motion to proceed, by rule, you have to run the clock for 30 hours before you can even start debate on a piece of legislation. At that point, you start debate on a piece of legislation, amendments can be offered, and assuming there's a open floor process where debate's not cut off or where, both sides don't cut off amendments that are being offered and allow votes on amendments, you could in theory drag out a piece of legislation indefinitely, just offering amendments being debated on it. At that point though, if there's, let's say we'll have 48 hours of debate on a bill. At that point you have a second vote called a cloture vote, which again takes 60 votes and requires 60 people to agree to cut off debate on a bill. If that's agreed to, it's another 30 hours before you can even vote on final passage of a bill. So it's distinctly possible that any piece of legislation that's brought through the Senate floor can take upwards of 2 weeks to just move, which, considering what the congressional calendar looks like, is pretty, you can really condense down that, grind the process to a halt. You can do the same thing on nominations. So we're looking at, the Treasury Secretary needs to be confirmed, the Commerce Secretary needs to be confirmed, Labor Secretary, all these cabinet secretaries. Democrats can slow the process down to basically take a week on the floor for each nomination, which, as you can imagine, if you're looking at a week for each nomination on the floor, plus a Supreme Court nominee that's going to have to come, it doesn't leave a whole lot of time for actually legislating and introducing legislation and moving bills forward.
Especially when they have so many days off in between.
Yes. Although the congressional calendar this year is far more rigorous than it has been in years past. Now that Republicans control all three branches, they're going to work on Mondays, Fridays, and not take nearly as many weeks off.
Daniel, in the nominations process you described, is there a limit on the length of time that a committee can be investigating a nominee and questioning him?
So there's no rules about how long the process takes through committee. Generally speaking, there's 2 days of hearings on cabinet level nominees. So that'd be the secretary, not deputy secretary or assistant secretary positions. There's 2 days of hearings. 1 day is dedicated just to the nominee, and 1 day is dedicated to witnesses that both sides call related to the nominee. So you might call, a colleague who worked with a nominee at a particular place, or you might call, let's take the Treasury Secretary, for instance. In his previous life as head of a mortgage company or a bank that dealt in mortgages, it's come out that the group foreclosed on a 90-year-old woman over 27-cent mispayment. So it's distinctly possible that you could see Democrats calling this 90-year-old woman to come testify, and each member on the committee gets their 5 minutes to ask questions. And on the Senate Finance Committee, you're looking at 19 members, so you can just imagine how long that takes, and they can use their 5 minutes, and every Democrat could just sit up there and say, so tell me again, how much money was there in balance before you got evicted? And they can just do that over and over again. That said, to get to the actual hearing can take weeks. There's a process in place that nominees are required to do. They have to fill out a nomination questionnaire. which is pretty similar to an FBI background check form, if anybody's ever had that, every place you've ever lived for the last 10 years, every job you've ever had for the last 10 years, every tax return, every financial statement, references, every time you've left the country in the last 10 years, all that needs to be documented, and then committee staff needs to be given time to actually investigate all that. So I had a meeting yesterday with the Senate Finance Committee, and they were telling me that because Munchin's financials are so complicated and they haven't received any of the documents yet, that they're planning a minimum of 3 weeks just to investigate his financials before they even move forward with a hearing. And given that most of the appointments that Trump has made to his cabinet are people who are similarly situated with very complex finances, it's going to take a very long time to move that process forward. It won't take as much time for like Jeff Sessions, who's the Attorney General nominee, because he's been in the Senate for the last 20 years. So he has to fill out financial disclosures every year as a senator, and they're sort of collegial. You're a colleague, we'll move the process forward with you. So his hearings have already been announced as, I think, January 12th and 13th or 11th and 12th.
They can do that before the inauguration then?
They can do that, yeah. So when President Obama won in 2008 and Democrats controlled the Senate and actually had 59 senators, they moved 8 of the nominations through the hearing process leading up to January 20th, and on January 20th, they actually voted on confirmation on all 8 nominees. So when President Obama was sworn in at noon on the 20th, he had 8 of his cabinet secretaries already in place. My guess is that Republicans will get maybe 1 or 2 through on January 20th, but they won't be able to get 8. Yep.
You can kill a nomination in committee. How does that function?
So after the hearing, after you have a hearing, you have to have something called the committee markup, which is the process by which the members of the committee vote out the nomination. And so because it's a 52-48 split in the Senate, we're mostly looking at a scenario where the committees are 10-9. Republicans have 10 members, Democrats have 9 members on the committee. And if you have to get at least, you have to be voted out favorably of the committee, or at least, it be voted out maybe a tie, and then the committee chairman can recommend the nomination to the floor sort of without prejudice from the committee. But for instance, the big one that could be blocked through committee is the Secretary of State nominee, because Rand Paul, who is a sort of to the left of a lot of Democrats when it comes to foreign policy, he's more of an isolationist, he's more of a, withdrawn from the foreign policy scene. He's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which votes out the Secretary of State nominee, and he's already raised serious concerns about President-elect Trump's foreign policy views and some of his nominees, like John Bolton, his Deputy Secretary of State, about being much more hawkish. And so he's said, I won't support that person. And as long as all the Democrats vote in line, you can block the person in the committee that way. Anyway, so that's sort of the big picture world that we're getting into. In terms of policy, there are sort of 3 areas to look for. The first is on the issue of taxes. So on taxes, you have corporate taxes, international taxes, personal taxes. There's 2 different sort of blueprints for how to approach both of these. There's the House Republican view, and then there's the more Senate Republican view. Sort of just as a little bit of background, Speaker Ryan is more of a policy ideologue than Senator McConnell, the majority leader. So what I mean by that is that Paul Ryan is very steadfast, and these are the policy positions I believe, and we're going to push forward an agenda that fits this. And if we lose an election as a result of that, so be it. But these are the policy positions I hold, and this is the agenda I want to put forward. Mitch McConnell is kind of the complete opposite. Mitch McConnell is much more of a, we need to do everything we can to keep Senate Republicans in the majority, and if that means that we can't move as far on policy as Ryan wants to, so be it, but we have to protect our majority, and that's more important than passing some big sweeping change in the American policy landscape. So it's creating sort of a loggerheads between the two sides on what to do, and a perfect example is on corporate taxes. If we're up to Senator McConnell, basically what they would do is slash the corporate rate from 35% now to somewhere between 20 and 25%. Close a couple loopholes and deductions that are available. One of the big ones is interest deductibility, but generally leave the tax code on the corporate side how it is, don't just eliminate deductions entirely. And part of the reason for that is there's reasonable social policy behind certain deductions. The easiest one to sort of grasp is the idea of the healthcare deduction. Like, that's an incentive for employers to provide healthcare. Paul Ryan, on the other hand, really wants to slash rates as far as he can get them, thinking as far down as 15%, and simplify the tax code as much as possible, which means wiping out almost all deductions entirely. The problem with that is there are a whole bunch of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies that right now pay an effective tax rate far less than 15%. And they're not going to be happy with all their deductions going away and now being told you have to pay 15%. Because now we're paying 7, 8, 9%. Facebook's a great example of that. Apple's a great example. So one of the things that House Republicans have proposed is a border adjustability tax, which is really complicated, and I'm not a tax attorney. I did go to law school, but I'm not a tax attorney, so forgive me if I sort of botch some of the details. But the idea would be if you were a company in the United States, headquartered in the United States, who makes a product. Let's say you make a widget. That widget that is sold in the United States, you would have to pay tax on the revenue generated from sales in the United States. However, if you export that widget, you would not have to pay any sales on the profits that you generate and the revenue you generate from sales outside of the borders of the United States. The problem with this is it doesn't address service industries, the financial sector, the legal world, where let's say you are working at a law firm that has an office in New York City, but also has an office in London, and a partner in London and a partner in New York City are working on a same project, generating revenue for the law firm, but some of that revenue is being generated from overseas. How do you tax that? So then they came up with this idea of, well, let's tax imports. We won't tax exports, but we'll tax imports. And obviously, as you can imagine, some of the retailers, and the firm that I work at actually represents a couple different retailers, so we're really conscious of this, have gone nuts. That we're not going to tax exports, but we're going to create a tax on imports, and we're going to have to pay a tax on sales that happen in the United States. A company like Walmart is going to get absolutely hammered on this, whereas a company like Boeing, you just signed a $15 billion deal to sell planes in Iran, just avoided taxes on $15 billion worth of revenue. So there's already a huge fight going on there, and then local constituent issues take effect, like obviously the Arkansas delegation carrying water for Walmart is going absolutely nuts about this and saying this is dead on arrival with us. So there's this whole way of trying to figure out how do we tax business profits that are here, try to incentivize jobs and manufacturing staying in the United States, but at the same time simplify the tax code as much as possible. To be completely honest, I don't know where they'll settle. The word that I've heard from sort of both sides is that House Republicans are going to push a really complicated corporate tax reform structure forward. It'll come over to the Senate. The Senate will just say, we're never touching this thing ever, and they'll let it die on the grapevine, and then the solution will be, let's just cut the corporate tax rate from 35 to 25 and call it a day. Leave every deduction that's already there and just call it a day. On the personal side, it's sort of a similar idea in that Republicans want to simplify the tax, at least House Republicans want to simplify the tax code to 3 brackets. They want 4, because Speaker Ryan counts the 0% tax bracket when he's put forward his plan. So you'd have the 0% tax bracket, a 12.5% tax bracket, a 25% tax bracket, and then a 33.5% tax bracket, but that number is a little bit squishy. So at times it's been 25, at times it's been 30, and now they're sort of settling on 33.5 because that's where they see an ability to actually not lose trillions of dollars in revenue that you can never make up for in spending cuts. I don't know that that's going to be successful either. If I had to guess of what you're going to see on the personal income side, it's going to be something similar to the Bush tax cuts again, in which case you'll keep multiple, the 7 or 8 brackets that we have now, but you'll just sort of lower the high-end rates a little bit more in line with the other ones. You might see a couple deductions fall by the wayside, but I can't imagine there's going to be huge closing of certain deductions either. For instance, some of the deductions that you'll see closed might be mortgage on a second home, or depreciation on a yacht, or depreciation on your private plane. Those types of things that sort of everybody can wrap their head around and say, these are only going to the uber super wealthy, a lot of them, we can close those. But I can't imagine you're going to see things like the earned income tax credit repealed, or interest paid on student loans repealed, or interest on mortgage on your first home repealed. Some of those things that really benefit both wealthy people and lower income people. There's just no way that I think there's going to be the appetite to cut it.
How about AMT?
AMT has been a fight for years and years and years, and nobody's sort of figured out how to address it. And my guess is that's where we'll end up again, where you might see the AMT raised a little bit, the ceiling on the AMT raised a little bit. But it just creates so much revenue that it's hard to repeal. So everybody from a policy standpoint says the original intent of the AMT is not what we have now. It was originally intended for high-income people to make sure that they were paying taxes and weren't able to avoid it entirely. It's sort of been hit on a squarely middle-class to upper-middle-class families who can't afford complex tax lawyers to avoid it and make decent incomes, but are by no means wealthy, are now sort of bearing the brunt of the burden on that. But it just generates so much revenue that it's hard to figure out a way to recoup that revenue without, massive spending cuts that nobody has the appetite for. And then there's international tax reform, which the big one there is the idea of sort of addressing double taxation and trying to encourage corporations to repatriate money. When it looked like Democrats were going to take back the majority and Hillary Clinton was going to be elected president, there was basically a deal in place to have a repatriation fee of 14%, bring that money home and pay for an infrastructure plan. Republicans are a little more emboldened now that they've taken the Senate, kept the House, and won the White House to say 14% was a little high for us. Maybe we want to go down to 8% or 9%. And then it's obviously the idea of what you do with some of this money. Republicans would rather use repatriation to be a pay for corporate tax cuts and personal tax cuts Democrats still would like to use repatriation to fund an infrastructure project, which sort of gets us to our next policy standpoint of spending. For the last 8 years, or at least the last 6 years, we've sort of been told in Congress, especially on the House side, that debt and deficit is all that matters, that we can't spend because we have a growing debt of 19 trillion, that we have a deficit. And, so when President Obama asked for an infrastructure bill, it was dead on arrival there. When they've asked for sort of increased funding for some safety net stuff like food stamps, like the WIC program, which is women, infants, and needy children benefits, pays for things like diapers for poor people. Those types of things, we've been told we don't have any money for this because the debt and deficit was high. We have to cut sort of spending across the board. President-elect Trump has a different view than what has been sort of the mainstream Republican view. He believes that, debt and deficits don't really matter, that when interest rates are as low as they are now, granted they went up yesterday and the Fed's indicated that they're going to possibly raise rates, upwards of 3 times in 2017, that borrowing money to spend on things like infrastructure is a really good idea. That view is shared by Democrats who were saying, shouting from the rooftops that when you literally have people who are paying us for the safety and security of a 30-year Treasury bond, that we should of course be borrowing money and spending it on things like infrastructure, which is sort of proven to be the #1 job creator. The world we're in now is there's still appetite for an infrastructure bill. The question is, what does it look like and how is it paid for? So the what does it look like is it just roads, bridges, airports, or is it also going to be a complete redoing of the electric grid, for instance? Is it going to be laying down broadband all over the country, so if you live on a Native American reservation in North Dakota, you have access to high-speed internet the same way that you would if you live 3 blocks from here. Some of those details still need to be worked out about the scope of it. So President-elect Trump has said he's willing to go up to $1 trillion in an infrastructure bill. Democrats are applauding the idea of $1 trillion infrastructure bill that's universal, that does all of that. House Republicans have said infrastructure bills are giveaways and are stimulus bills, and we don't need a stimulus. Mitch McConnell has said infrastructure bill is a decent idea. We need to start to rebuild our infrastructure, but $1 trillion is way too much. So there's going to have to be some give and take on both sides about the size of it, and obviously the price tag will impact how broadly it goes to, or what is entailed in infrastructure. The second thing is pay for. So Democrats want to pay for it through a repatriation and then the creation of a public-private infrastructure bank. So the idea basically that the government would put $250 million into an infrastructure bank, private sector will put $250 billion into an infrastructure bank, and so if you're putting money towards an infrastructure project, you can borrow money from this infrastructure bank on the federal side to help fund a project. Republicans, or at least the Trump proposal, has involved a lot more privatization of infrastructure. So it involves the idea that rather than the federal government either paying directly to repave roads, to redo airports, to build out our infrastructure, new bridges, that instead will incentivize private companies to do that, both through a tax credit and then a guaranteed 6% return on their investment that they do. So that means if they build a bridge, that this private company will be able to charge for the bridge, and the federal government will guarantee them at least a 6% return. So if they don't get enough traffic to generate a 6% profit, that the federal government will kind of step in and help them out to encourage the private sector to rebuild our infrastructure, which would keep the cost down on the federal side.
That means more toll roads, right?
It means more toll roads. It means that a whole host of things that right now we consider public goods and services would no longer necessarily be public goods and services. I don't know how much appetite, and that's the President-elect Trump's idea. I've never heard Congress talk about this idea, and part of it is there's a certain expectation, I think, that the public has and voters have, that certain utilities are public utilities and are public goods, and we have access to them for free because we pay taxes. So we're already paying for them through, sales taxes, through property taxes, through income taxes, the same way that, we expect that when we call the police are going to come and we're not going to get a bill from them 2 weeks later for the services they provide. So the same thing would sort of happen with infrastructure plan, is that we have an expectation that most of our roads, especially federal highways, are going to be toll-free. We have an expectation that we're not going to have to pay a fee just to walk through an airport door because some private company was hired and contracted out to upgrade an airport. We do pay taxes now on our broadband services, but we expect that there's not going to be an extra tax on that to help pay for the company that laid broadband lines across the country. There's certain expectations that I don't think the public would ever give up, and the backlash on those things would prevent ever this real super privatization of infrastructure. Also, Democrats would never go for it, and so they would use the filibuster to kill it in the Senate. So that's sort of where we are on this sort of big picture spending side. And then on regulation, President-elect Trump has said for every regulation that's put in place, he's going to repeal 2 regulations that already exist. Republicans are going to use the Congressional Review Act to repeal every regulation basically that's been passed for the last 7 months. That includes the overtime rule that we've heard about. It includes a whole bunch of environmental rules. Republicans are going to, back out of the Paris climate deal that President Obama signed in a couple months ago. It means that things like the fiduciary rule now will probably end up being rolled back. And then even on things that they can't use the Congressional Review Act, they'll use the appropriations process to deregulate the economy and deregulate sectors of the economy. So we talked about Dodd-Frank before. It's awfully hard to repeal Dodd-Frank in its entirety. Instead, what Republicans can do is they can use the appropriations process, the spending process, how Congress funds the government, to put things called riders on the budget. So that, for instance, could mean the SEC cannot use any funds to regulate X. They can't, and because they control spending and they control the purse, they can put conditions on how that money gets spent, which also means that they can basically say you can't, even though regulation exists, is on the books, and legally, this industry needs to adhere to this regulation, because the enforcement agencies have been told they can't actually enforce those regulations. There's very little reason why business would actually conform to them, because they have no penalty to actually being penalized for not adhering to it. So that's sort of the world that we're going to go into, is that I expect to see over the next 2 years a concerted effort to roll back everything that sort of happened over the last 8 years, to pass big sweeping tax reform and cut taxes across the board on all sides. My Republican friends say the same thing. It is far more conservative than a cabinet you would have seen if Mitt Romney had won 4 years ago or John McCain won 8 years ago, and is far more conservative than anything President Bush did in his 8 years. And so we're seeing, for instance, we have a labor secretary nominee who is on the record saying that everywhere we can automate, we should automate, because robots don't take sick days and don't get pregnant and, never file a discriminatory lawsuit. We have an EPA director who is very hostile, or an EPA nominee who's very hostile to, any sort of environmental regulation at all. We have a attorney general nominee who in 1986 was nominated to be a federal judge, and his nomination to the federal judge was blocked and he wasn't confirmed because there were issues over whether he was racist or not and whether he, could actually serve as a federal judge because of his views on race. And it just sort of all the way along. We have a my wife's a teacher, so the education secretary one rings true to me. We have an education secretary who never went to public school and doesn't believe in public education, wants all schools to be privatized and allow for-profit companies to run the school system. So what I expect to see is a lot of Trump using his bully pulpit to keep sort of the union populists who are more inclined to support a Democrat but came over and voted for Trump in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, happy by doing these carrier type deals, while he allows the cabinet secretaries to pass regulatory reforms or do things in terms of enforcement that make the Tea Party happy and the sort of anti-government right happy, so that way he can have a little bit of both going on there.
Can you, it might be too early for this, but can you mention anything that you've heard in terms of two areas? One, Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
I know that President Trump in the campaign, President-elect Trump in the campaign said that, he wanted to keep it intact,
Mm-hmm.
but there was an article, I think, in the Fiscal Times a few days ago where they were, a Republican congressman was talking about certain things that they wanted to do, and the other one was in, I believe, Medicare for like premium support coming from Paul Ryan.
Sure. So I'll take Social Security first. As you mentioned, on the campaign trail, President-elect Trump was very forthright and very aggressive in saying we're going to protect Social Security, we're not going to cut Social Security, that the Social Security Trust Fund is not going bankrupt, that all you need is small little tweaks on the margins here or there to solve it, but we're not going to do anything with Social Security. House Republicans don't share that view. The House Republican view is a combination of sort of three things. The first is benefit cuts, sort of almost across the board benefit cuts. Essentially, the only people who won't experience benefit cuts are the super poor. But those who are on Social Security disability, for instance, they would see a benefit cut. The second thing they want to do is means test, which means essentially that we run Social Security against your income. If you're really well-to-do, you're going to get a smaller benefit than you otherwise would have. If you remember back to some of and there were so many of them that I forget which one, but one of those times the government was going to shut down and the debt ceiling wasn't going to be raised and we were going to have fiscal calamity, and President Obama and Speaker Boehner at the time were talking about a grand bargain. Democrats actually were willing to give a little bit on means testing. That position has changed. That was sort of like, okay, we're going to have a grand bargain and you're going to give us tax increases and various other things, we'll give you means testing. The Democratic position has now shifted not just to we're not going to give you means testing, but we actually want to see Social Security benefits increased. And to do that, we want to lift the ceiling on the income ceiling for Social Security tax. They would lift it on the individual side. They wouldn't lift it on both sides. So if you're LeBron James and you make $30 million this year playing basketball, it's not just the first $119,000 of your income that's going to be taxed to Social Security. It would basically be the full $30 million if the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing got their way, and then they'd put a cap on it of other Dems have said, why don't we just raise it to $250,000 and everything in between. That said, a congressman named Sam Johnson from Texas, who is on the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax writing committee, and he's also the chairman of the subcommittee on Social Security, released a plan on Social Security Thursday of basically a week ago, that got pillaged by most people because it basically creates a 38% cut on average benefit for people, while raising the retirement age to 70, phased into 72 over time. For somebody like me, it would be 72. It wouldn't do anything for people who are currently on Social Security, with the exception of they roll back the yearly increases as a result of inflation. So they would basically just stop that and just say, here's your benefit. So the benefit you get today and the benefit you get 10 years from now is going to be the same. But that would be the only sort of immediate cut to it. It would be start to phase in over time, but people who looked at it sort of said that the average person can expect a 38% benefit cut across the board. I don't think that plan has any sort of support to move forward, and Democrats are actually dying for Republicans to try to move on that. And so we saw it before in 2006, 2007, or 2005, when Bush tried to start his Social Security privatization plan, and it got dropped almost as quickly as it started because Democrats created a great sort of messaging plan around it, and we're going to make that their single campaign issue moving forward. And the thing that comes with Social Security, and you all can probably tell me better than I can, but even if you tell people who are on Social Security now, your benefits are going to stay, we're not going to cut them, they don't want anything done to Social Security because they see how great the program is and working, and they want their kids and their grandkids to have it. So Republicans think they're being a little creative and saying, well, we won't do anything to people who are 65 or older, or even 55 and older now. We'll phase it in on younger people, and then we might give them an opportunity to opt out of Social Security entirely, and we'll allow them they'll still pay into Social Security, and then each year we'll send them a check, and they can invest that check on their own, and that'll be their retirement plan. There's just not an appetite for that because people have seen how Social Security works. So I expect to see it still talked about a lot. I still expect to see Paul Ryan talk about it, to be some fear-mongering about Social Security is going broke, and if we don't fix it this year, nobody's ever going to get a benefit ever. But there's not political appetite to do something on Social Security. Medicare, the proposal on Medicare is basically to create, as you said, a premium subsidy and sort of a block grant program around it, the similar way that they want to block grant Medicaid. So now, you pay into Medicare and you have your Medicare plan, which covers a variety of healthcare services, not all healthcare services. It doesn't cover dental, it doesn't cover other things, but it's sort of catastrophic care plus for people. What Republicans want to do is instead basically give each person a subsidy that would vary around $9,000 a year and say, here's your subsidy, go buy health insurance on the private market.
Wow.
The issue and then they would there'd be sort of adjustments to that premium support as you got older, but I don't know of a healthcare plan in the world or a healthcare company in the world that's going to offer healthcare to a 90-year-old person. So there's an internal fight there between, well, how do we save costs on Medicare, and Republicans want to sort of privatize everything, but I can't even envision that happening because no insurer is going to step up and say, well, we'll offer this product if you leave the market. That's sort of the Republican argument on privatization a lot, is that, for instance, one thing that they're pushing and that we're going to see this year is the idea of privatizing air traffic controllers. So air traffic controllers now are under the purview of the FAA. Republicans tried last year to privatize air traffic controllers when they did the Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization. It actually, as weird as it sounds, it actually has some bipartisan support. Democrats don't just rule it out of hand. And part of that's because a lot of air traffic controllers actually will come to members of Congress, and the union who represents air traffic controllers has come to Congress and say, it's actually not that crazy as it sounds. You'd need a whole bunch of regulations put on it, a whole bunch of oversight put on it, but the idea of just privatizing it isn't a bad thing. But that's partly there. You can privatize air traffic controllers because somebody's willing to step in and be the company that will hire all the air traffic controllers that are now and pay them and do this. I just don't see it with healthcare for seniors of people willing to step in and say, oh, we think we can make money off of being the healthcare provider for seniors. And then especially if you have things like you can't deny coverage for pre-existing conditions that remain there, it just would create there's just no way to feasibly do it. So instead what I think they'll do is they might try to put forward a Medicaid reform bill that makes some cuts along the edges. You always see things like reimbursement rates to hospitals and doctors, they keep slowly rolling that back, slashing reimbursement payments. Basically, they try to find the tipping point where doctors and hospitals will continue to take these patients, but if you cut them $1, that's when they drop the patients. You might see some rolling back of certain coverage, so they might try to nip and tuck a little bit about things that Medicare will actually cover. One of the big things I think that can be done to sort of reform it is looking at end-of-life care and trying to create a disincentive for doctors who, if you have a patient who's on Medicare who might be 95 or might only have 6 months to live, that a doctor's not saying, you know what that person needs is a brand new hip. And the family's saying, well, that person, my grandmother or my mother or my father is never walking again anyway. They're sort of bedridden, wheelchair bound. Why do they need a new hip? And the doctor says, well, I think it'll make them more comfortable. Those types of costs that happen at the very end, or, like with my grandmother at the end of her life, a doctor was like, we should have that mole removed. She's 3 weeks to live and you're going to charge Medicare $17,000 to have a mole removed. Like, those are the types of things that you can put more restrictions on that will sort of keep the cost of it down. That I think there might be appetite on both sides of the aisle, but a full, undoing of Social Security and Medicare, I can't imagine will happen.
Daniel,
I think we're getting, maybe this should be the last question, because I think we're running out of time here.
Daniel, there's it's very popular, and for, in my opinion, good reason, for the desire for egregiously high drug costs to be brought down. As I understand it, there was a deal made with Obama that he would not negotiate for government cutbacks, using the power of government to create cutbacks in drug costs. Do you see in this very popular mode for the government to move to, and for Trump to move to really intimidate and bring down the costs of drugs?
So there's sort of two avenues on this front. The first one is that Republicans have tried to deal with what drives drug prices to get high in the first place. So it's, R&D costs, it's the FDA approval process, those types of things that they say, well, the longer it takes the FDA to actually review a drug, the more we have to spend on R&D costs. The
shorter the patent life.
Yeah, the fact that we only have a 10-year patent on these drugs, that they're easy to re-engineer. So
why is it a drug like from Gilead, the
EpiPen.
Harvoni drug?
EpiPen is a good example.
Well, yeah.
Okay, you pay for, with insurance, $3,600 a month for Harvoni,
Yeah.
for Hep C.
But you
For
get a
seniors.
cure with that.
You do, and
Versus
there's no
chronic
doubt
care.
about it, it's better than pegylated interferon and ribavirin, absolutely. But in a country like Egypt,
Mhm.
$10 a month.
Yeah.
Why is it that the rest of the world can negotiate better than we can, and then all the surplus comes back to us
Well,
as
and that's,
R&D?
exactly, and that's
So
part of
why
it
not-
is that we pay more in drug, EpiPen's a perfect example. The reason that, well, there's sort of two reasons why EpiPen went up, but the two main reasons EpiPen went up when it did, the first one is that EpiPen's generic competitor had a recall. So EpiPen took advantage of market conditions at the time and said, we're the only one in the game. And ironically enough, it was a
So that's
senator's
monopoly.
daughter who is the CEO of Mylan. The second one is that at the same time that their competitor in the United States had a recall, they also renegotiated prices in the UK and
Yeah.
brought their prices down so they could make up the profit in the United States. So anyway, to sort of get back to it, the first is both the House and Senate and the President just signed yesterday something called the 21st Century Cures Act, which is a huge bill that deals with a whole host of things within the pharmaceutical drug company business. For instance, there's billions of dollars for Vice President Biden's cancer moonshot that was put in there. There's a whole bunch of money that goes to researching autoimmune diseases, diabetes, Crohn's, colitis. There's money for orphan drug treatments. They finally put money behind opioid abuse. They put a whole bunch of money behind mental health. One of the things that they did within this bill is, which, judging from the reaction that we just had, might roll some eyes, is it allows drug companies much more streamlined process and FDA review, to the point that now they can send basically summary findings to the FDA on what their initial clinical trials look like on a drug, and the FDA can't come back to them and say, we need the full study. That they only have to look
Will
at
that
the...
cut down on the price?
So the idea being that what it will do is it will get drugs to the market faster.
Like Europe?
Yeah. And so like one thing that I think can be done is and this sort of shows that both sides are a little bit to blame. And what I mean by that is if a drug's been approved in Europe and it's been on the market for 5 years, the FDA can't just be like, oh, this drug's on the market in Europe for the last 5 years and has been working fine and there's no issue, so we're just going to clear it. The FDA says, no, we have to go through our own review process. So you have a drug that people have been taking throughout the world for years, but the FDA will come back at them and say, you know, in your initial testing on field mice that we don't believe that there was enough causation.
That sounds like an agency we should cut back on.
Well, and so that's what the 21st Century Cures Act significantly rolls back the red tape that the FDA puts on drugs. In terms of drug price negotiation, there's a lot more appetite for that on the Democratic side than the Republican side, because the idea always on the Republican side is, let's get government out of it, the free market will decide it. Bernie Sanders had a plan to really crack down on drugs, which basically says this: there's no such thing as a drug patent anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is create a government grant program, and if you create a drug and we value it to have a benefit, you don't get a patent on that, but we're going to give you a reward. So depending on what the drug is, we might give you, drug company, $500 billion in a reward because you just created a cure for cancer. But we're not going to give you a patent on that drug, so that way generics and other people can come in and do it. There's not a whole lot of incentive on that one to put money into R&D, so that's sort of dead on arrival. But there should be more negotiation in terms of government prices. I think one of the big problems is American people don't demand it. And a perfect example is in California, there was a ballot initiative in November for the state of California to negotiate drug prices directly with drug companies and say, if you sell a drug in the state of California, we negotiate the price. And the ballot measure got crushed. Got absolutely
The
crushed.
lobbyists?
part of it is the health insurance or the drug companies spent billions of dollars or millions of dollars to brand the drug something else, and a whole bunch of veterans groups came out against it. I don't know why, but it got absolutely crushed.
Daniel, the single factor that resulted in these high prices is that when Medicare Part D was passed in the Bush administration,
Right.
the pharmaceutical companies
They were
convinced
planned.
Bush and Congress not to put on any price
Yep.
negotiation. We are one of the few countries in the world that does not allow the government to negotiate prices on
And the
drugs
same-
that are paid for by the
Everybody does.
government.
And the same
that's the
thing-
single biggest factor.
And
Is
the
that
same-
gonna go,
No, the same thing happened in the Affordable Care Act, that the initial draft of the bill was going to have government negotiate drug prices, also allow basically to eliminate borders. So you can buy drugs directly
Right.
from Canada or Mexico or the UK. And to get buy-in from the pharmaceutical companies, which they needed for other parts of the laws, they pulled that out. And I think that's just sort of the issue of where we're going, although the last thing I'll say, because I know we're running out of time, is Trump did come out the other day and say that it is disgusting that drug companies will raise their prices for absolutely no reason. I just don't see any appetite to move anything forward because, again, there's this belief on one side of the aisle that the invisible hand of the market is what will keep drug prices where there should be. And if EpiPen's charging $1,600 for a single shot injector, it's because that's what the market says they should be able to charge. And who are we to tell a company that they can't make profits off of kids with allergies or, anything else? So that's sort of the world that we're going to be living in for the next 4 years.
Okay, I wanted to thank Daniel for.
The economy now is not doing badly. Trump has been able to present the Trump brand and include that in the stock market. Things are okay. Trump is creating the benefits so far. The economy is structurally ready to handle, in my opinion, a step up in costs, in expenditures on infrastructure, on tax cut. We will pick up growth. And you've just heard from Daniel that there's going to be money around, corporate money, repatriation money, which will help corporate profits, and there's going to be declines in costs that go on. So, there's only one problem. They're already in the stock market. The stock market is anticipating what Trump is going to do in an idealistic framework, that everything that he does will work out well. Now, it's one thing for me to say things are going to be great when the market is down because of Trump fear. It's another thing, and to say that there shouldn't be that much fear, and there was I wrote to you all a one-page, a one-day step up as early as one day, and that's what we've had. It's amazing what contrarian thinking will do. Contrarian thinking on Brexit, contrarian thinking on the Italian election. Renzi, if he's rejected, then we're in great trouble. The EU is in trouble. Meanwhile, the Italian stock market moved up the first day that he let out. So let me mention some of the risks that we have now. The dollar can continue to move up. If the dollar continues to move up, there are going to be problems because of higher interest rates, a decline. The rise of the dollar leads to the decline of everything invested abroad, and there's a lot of S&P 500 money invested abroad. I don't think it's going to happen, but consensus says it's going to happen. Today it happened. I think ultimately that's not going to happen. I think also inflation is going to be a stronger element than people realize and earlier than people realize. It is hand in hand, would go hand in hand with corporate slowdown, I should say speed up in GDP. The potential for Trump. If you want to negotiate with China, that's not a bad idea. I don't think Obama said we're all good guys. They're good guys on both sides. Let's shake hands and be good with each other. And of course, the other person had the upthrust finger, but he never saw that. So I don't think we should be as easy as Obama was. I think he was too idealistic. But why yell about and make yourself do what he did with Taiwan? I don't see that. It just ticks people off. It makes, the most important thing to an Asian is face. Do you know that? How important face is? Embarrassment, then you just get into, and then he himself is a very sensitive guy. Couldn't you just see the two of them, going head to head? In Japan, things are so bad. There's no word no in Japan. You wanted to go to the movies with me tonight? Yes. You don't want to go to the movies with me tonight? Yes. Figure that out. I said to my daughter, how do you figure what happened? She said, well, around 2, 3 o'clock, if you're supposed to go to the movies, you get up. If they don't get up, it meant no. I think there are straighter ways to do that. A rate rise, we're going to have, we've had a rate rise, and we're going to have more rate rises, assuming that we get the strengthening in growth, we're going to have that. What it comes down to is you don't want to put. I think Trump has a decent shot at getting his stuff through, and that he's going to say, you see, I made America great again, but that will be premature. He'll probably the first chance he gets, he's going to say it, and then say it 40,000 more times. But it won't be. That won't be true. But it will be true. There's a good chance that he's going to help, and he's going to be helped by a lot of other things, including the Republican Party being the ones who are talking about the spending rather than the Democrats. Just like it was Nixon who went after China and was not expected. He was supposed to be the tough guy against China. And could get it by being so tough, he was able to get everybody to go along with what he had to say. So we're looking at emerging markets. I tell you how much the market has moved up. Just one idea. We put money into we had money already in through the funds we have, value-oriented funds, and a few months ago, we put more money into a separate fund called a regional bank fund. Only banks. Do you know what that fund is up? 40%. This isn't a stock. It's a portfolio of banks.
Does that include Brazil, Russia, China?
No, it was not international. We have the friend that we had over here for our meeting. He's up 25% in just what you're talking about. We to the extent to which the market continues up from here, we're going to take some of the money because there are no real. That's where financials was the value-oriented part of the market, and even now, when interest rates move up, financials actually benefit. Banks benefit from higher interest rates. Your bonds don't benefit from higher interest rates. So we're going to have to decide what to do, and if something comes up, we'll move more quickly, but not with just a few, not for just a few for 5% moves. We're looking for extended moves, and we've done more. You should all who are clients know that we've been more active as more opportunities have come this year. So we'll see in the future, but we may be putting more money in developing markets. At least we're going to be considering doing that. And I'll just tell you something. There are various stages for Trump. The first stage, he's won, and he's up about the same amount as Ronald Reagan was up at about the same time. And the markets for after election usually go up, and one of the things that you may find puzzling, right after the person is inaugurated, the markets go down. It's like the dream is okay as long as it's a dream. As soon as the reality comes to bear, boom. So we'll have to see, because we'll probably ride through that if it isn't, because there'll be the second move if there's a decline, and that'll be the move based on his being able to get his program through and speeding up our country. But the markets aren't cheap. They're not at bubble territory. We get out, but they're not cheap. They're pretty fully priced in the U.S., and so we'll be looking abroad to see what comes about. I think that's all I wanted to say. If you have questions, ask me.
Well, what about, everybody's talking about infrastructure, and whatever the amount is, as I understand it, implementing infrastructure programs takes a long time.
Yes.
It does not happen overnight. There needs to be planning, there needs to be contracts awarded, there needs to be the funding arranged, and then the hiring process starts. So when these people who voted for Trump in the Midwest and part of the South felt that they needed to get back to where they were 30 years ago, it's not going to happen for what, maybe at the soonest a year, maybe 2 years.
Yeah, it's going to be staged in. That's what's going to happen. It's not, if you did it all in 1 year, then everybody would start to look over, oh my God, what's going to happen next year? We're all this spending this year and none next year.
But what is that going to do to the companies that are right now benefiting from this rise in the market?
Well, it's over. They're anticipating something, and which may take 5 to 10 years of spending. Not, if there's $1 trillion or $500 billion, it's going to be done in a more reasonable fashion, and let the markets be where they are. We have people that are quick on the gun. We have 2 new people are quick on the gun. They came in with defense. Let's do defense the day of, and gulp. 2 days later, that was the end of defense. So that's not going to work. And those people who have that mentality are going to end up losing. The market itself had winners and losers. The losers were interest rate people, yield people.
Technology.
Yeah, technology is something, both drugs, that's why I asked him that question, drugs and technology are things, we put a little money in drugs now, and technology itself, there are parts of technology that are interesting. One of them is biotech. It's very volatile. So, but we talked to one guy, you don't know how many calls we make. So there's one guy, I have a call with him, and hello, and he says, hello, hello. I can't find any good companies. Nobody asked him yet. And things are just, everybody's taking my companies and they're taking them and purchasing them. And I could just see his PR person. Oh my God, the guy is offering how is he going to get Altfest to invest if he's so skeptical? Well, that's really not what I like. I like straightforward information, and that guy gave it. So I told him, the next time we go into technology, we're going to be going with you. Now, I happen to have a very good record as well. So, did I handle your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, I saw that there was fear that Trump had turned against all the Silicon Valley people, and he had them all sitting around the table yesterday, and then they all came out smiling.
Yeah.
You know, he wants to jawbone Apple into bringing all their money back, and he wants to get them to do more of their manufacturing in the U.S. instead of abroad. And it just, I don't think there's much likelihood. I mean, maybe some money will come back if the tax code changes. But there's no reason that right now Apple, with all its money overseas, couldn't borrow against their overseas affiliates and bring money back. But they're not interested in building plants here.
Yeah.
They'd rather build them
afford their phones at
elsewhere.
$1,000.
So that's why I think it's a real problem to get those high-tech organizations
I
back
think
here.
the IBM she came out and called it, the white collar, blue collar, she called it the new collar. And I think she has it right. There are jobs out there that just haven't been.
Well, people are not trained and they're not
That's
willing
the
to.
That should be
So
part
there
of,
is
that should be part of
magnet
the infrastructure.
Absolutely. Anything else, it could be pharmaceutical, anything that hasn't been done yet, because automation is eating their lunch. It's not
That's
so
right,
much
it's
the
not
needs and
international,
everything
you're
else.
right, you're right.
It's mostly automation,
Well,
and we have to recognize that.
Like, you're,
Every time Trump comes out with a very personal statement about a company, such as Boeing, such as, the stock goes all the way down. So we have someone who's very mercurial and very unpredictable in terms of the statements he's making about various sectors of the business world as well as specific companies. How is that going to ultimately pan out in terms of the market and investors?
I don't know, let's see if he moves substantially. It's very cool to do a carrier's thing. Everybody hears about it, and it has no real effect except on one factory level. Maybe that's what we're going to have.
Not even.
Maybe we're going to have a
Affects United
ladder rather than a
Technologies.
wall or
Yes.
something
Yes.
in Mexico.
Yeah.
Maybe he's not going to do. I just don't mess. I had lunch with Henry Kissinger. I had the same feeling. Don't mess with China.
Right.
Don't.
Right.
You're not dealing with the regular talk, Mr. Trump.
It's the sleeping lion.
This is a 5,000-year-old culture. You can't mess with that.
Yeah.
Jesus was recent history to them.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about, among other things, the cabinet, there seems to be no representation for the new world, for Silicon Valley, for new ideas. It's all, guys who've been around for a long time, old ideas.
All
Well,
the-
whatever you wanna
It's
call it,
all
but
the
the new
swamp
guys,
they were
no,
gonna clean
but
out.
the new guys, you don't have a Silicon, he doesn't seem to have anybody, who's coming in with new ideas. It's all the
Maybe
old
over
guys.
time, he's got people his own age who he feels comfortable with and can look up to, and are conservative.
He likes to be a ruler of generals.
Yeah, he doesn't have
But I mean, with
that
the
kind of
environment and so
idea.
many other things, we need new ideas, we need.
Yeah, he's gonna learn, he may learn, or someone will put a whisper in his ear that it isn't working. Hopefully, that will happen. And he's just
Somehow
one
when I
guy.
look at him and I hear his ideas and the people that he's surrounded himself with, I wish I wasn't thinking this way, but I see myself living in the land of disco in the 1980s. I really do. I see it as all gold and bronze, and I agree with you wholeheartedly.
I could,
Rather than
yeah.
looking globally and to space and everything
Yes.
else, we're so infested with this. Somehow I wish I wasn't feeling this way. I hope I'm being just overly pessimistic.
lot of us
Do you have
feel that
any
way.
insight
Yeah.
into why Gates compared him to JFK?
I don't know.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
That's
I don't know. Gates was going to Harvard and he left in the middle. He may be just a, he likes that about him.
I want to
Who
thank
knows?
Lou for his insightful remarks.